Oh yeah, let's go here. That's it.
You pick the
Got
god,
that.
sit there forever.
Zoom. And so participants, I will now. Okay, I'm muting everyone here. You can always unmute yourself, of course. And we'll do the countdown, so we'll make a start. So anybody who's following on Facebook or YouTube at the moment, you're very welcome. I know, Mark, sometimes you're out there, so hi if you are. And what am I doing? I am going to, there we go. And in fact, oh, hang on, no, wrong way. I'm being so professional at the moment. Okay, let's pretend I've just started now. So what I will do is we will go to here and we'll do welcome. There we go. Now we can make a proper start. So I was just explaining. I did when I was thinking about this a couple of weeks ago. I thought I would do all of the parables in 1 week, but actually I thought, seeing as it doesn't do them justice to kind of rush through, so I've broken it into 2 weeks. So probably next week will be our last week, and then we'll take a break for August. I'll see some folks down at Revive, the Ichthus Revive camp, and then we'll pick up again at the end of August, beginning of September. But it's been fantastic having you with me for the term, and hopefully we can recruit a few more people when I'm at that camp to see if they'd like to join us week by week. It's always nice to have a few voices. So we are, hang on, wheat. Have I spelled that incorrectly, haven't I? Oh, well, you know, display my ignorance. I think, no, is wheat, no, it's not 2 E's, is it? Oh, I've muted you, you can't tell me. It's 2 E's, or is it not 2 E's? No, don't worry, we'll leave it at that. I can't spell. I rely on the computers to remind me, and obviously didn't this time. So wheat, weeds, and mustard seeds. We're just going to cover a few of the parables.
It is right, Kristen.
It's correct. Okay, that's fantastic. I can cut that whole dialogue out in the final recording, so nobody knows I was insecure about my spelling. You know, so do you remember last week we were looking at Jesus introducing parables? He gave us the parable of the sower, and he was illustrating, as he gave that parable, the way in which we engage with what God wants to speak. And actually there's something very, very fundamental, because particularly this is when Jesus is talking to the masses. The majority of folks, as they're hearing what God wants to say, are needing to engage with it if they're going to understand with it. And that's kind of part of the challenge. And we're going to now, this week and then next week, we're going to look at some of those parables. And I wanted to think in various perspectives, because Jesus actually, to be helpful to the disciples, he unpacked one of the other parables we're going to look at this week. But he doesn't with the majority of them. And that's okay. We kind of do that for him, you know, and our churches tell you exactly what it means. And we lose, therefore, the impact it has when people are feeling that sense of something important is going on here. Some words are being spoken that I don't really understand, but I have to engage with them and understand them. And if I can be somewhat kind of, I was going to say irreverent. It's not really irreverent or blasphemy, but the motives behind the making of Monty Python's Life of Brian were kind of verging on the sort of, we want to be a bit insensitive and insulting towards things. But they really captured something in the bit where Jesus is teaching the Sermon on the Mount, and the people at the back are talking, and they mishear when he talks about blessed are the peacemakers as being blessed are the cheesemakers. And they start debating amongst themselves whether he literally means all literal cheesemakers, or whether it's all producers of dairy product that have some special status in the kingdom. And actually there's something very real in that kind of dialogue. That is almost exactly what Jesus is doing with the masses. He is giving them something that they have to talk about and debate. And it's often in the talking and debating about things that you start to recognize and see your own biases and perspectives. And in dialogue with the people around you, you realize that there's not just one way of looking at something. There are various. And that process, as we're drawn into it, the Spirit takes hold of and leads us into truth. So we're going to have some examples of how that works. And it's important to remind ourselves that is how Jesus has framed these parables. So we don't become too forensic in terms of our interpretations, but actually it's almost in the round and the discussion we have to understand them. Which of course we're going to cover this because this verse is actually quoted this week, but the framework of Psalm 78 verse 2, which is God speaking that I'll open my mouth in a parable, utter dark sayings of old. So that there are the deep mysteries of the kingdom are expressed in these stories that are a little bit fuzzy sometimes, and we have to juggle with. Some of you have seen during the week, and so I want to quote a reference, or during last week, that the Bill Johnson's wife died. Benny Johnson died. I look back over the years, and we had the opportunity to meet them several times, and she was always very delightful. And you understand the challenge of a church that has really tried to push out in terms of the breakthrough for healing, and I've seen some quite remarkable healings. And in that context, you ask yourself the question: must it feel like for someone who's pioneered in these ways, who lost first his father and now his wife to the issue of cancer? And he spoke the Sunday after she died, and he talked about the challenge of living in mystery and how greatest revelation comes when we're able to live in that mystery. And what Bill was driving at was, if we've got everything too tied up, we just kind of lean back on logical answers that don't necessarily satisfy us emotionally. When he talks about that kind of great revelation coming by living in mystery, he's not using the idea of mystery as an excuse not to think, because that's not what he's doing. Sometimes Christians use it that way. Oh, well, it's a mystery, so just not bother thinking about it. No, that's not what he's saying. What he's saying is I go into the tension. I don't understand, but I'm going to learn to try and understand in the context where I can't understand. And actually, it's in that place of dialogue that you start to get real revelationary insights. And that's a kind of quite a big and extreme level. But at a very small level, that's really what Jesus is saying about these parables. Is it's all kind of almost in the uncertainty. It could be this or it could be that actually we often find we are led to a place of greatest revelation. As a total flip side or a B side of that statement, I tend to believe the same, which is that it's those who live actively in mystery who are often the most gracious. And what I mean by actively is the opposite of when I'm saying, using mystery as an excuse not to think, but to live actively within that context, to say, well, okay, this is now my best understanding, but it may not be totally right. It might be another way of looking at it. So I hold it lightly. And that produces grace in people as well. So I see huge amounts of benefits to trying to approach parables the way Jesus kind of gives them to us. But anyway, let's get on to the text. Just looking. Oh, nice to see Bob's arrived as well. So yep, hi. So okay, up to chapter 13, verse 24. So he presented another parable to them. So the kingdom of heavens is like a man who sowed good seed in his field, but while people slept, his enemy came and sowed weeds also among the wheat and slipped away. And we often just put the word left or departed at the end there. The Greek has the sense of stepping aside, so I thought that's why slipped away kind of feels kind of like, okay, slipped away. But when the crop emerged and produced grain, the weed also appeared at the same time. And the estate holder's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds?" And this is actually, if you stop and divorce, or we divorce this from what comes next, we just read this. I've heard that this kind of discussion is such a common one. It's one that almost every believer and non-believer has gone through at some point. How can a good God have produced a world in which there's all these weeds? If I put it that way. It is one of the kind of broad level areas of mystery that we have to deal with. And yes, we can find some easy answers. I can sit here and recite some of them to you. An awful lot of what we think is bad doesn't come from God, comes from people, etc., etc. But fundamentally, there will always be those things that as far as you try to dig down, it still somehow feels, and you're left with this kind of question: how can, if you only sowed good things, if God is only good and only sowed those good things, how did it happen? And actually, the parable doesn't give us a simple, easy answer, because you have all kinds of questions like, where does the enemy come from? Why is he an enemy? but there's a level at which we kind of have to step in and accept, okay, this is the world, the way that God made it. It's got masses of good stuff in it, but there are some things, and the things that are there have the potential of spoiling everything. And where did they come from? And just to understand and get hold at this stage of it, it was not God's heart. There are other questions, and that's why we say we have to continuously kind of dig around and find a way within the mystery of where, why is that the case? And from an apologetic point of view, it's not like I couldn't sit here right now and give you all the standard kind of philosophical answers. But the problem I sometimes find is we are answering intellectually what is often motivated emotionally. Obviously, if it's motivated, it's got the same word in it, hasn't it? So in other words, when someone has died prematurely, it's very logical to say, death comes to everyone. Our life is just a whisper or just a wisp, etc., etc. The important thing is what's there in eternity and so on. Those answers are all can be potentially true, but they can be totally inappropriate, because at the moment the whole thing is motivated by the pain of loss and the pain of uncertainty. And so actually we've got to be sometimes careful at being so precise with our answers. That might be good logic, but actually to understand that very often the question has got this emotional layer in it. But so here we are encountering a world with the messed up things in it. And so Jesus then says, and he replied, and this is Jesus replying, an enemy did this. Sorry, so the enemy's done it. Jesus replies, an enemy did this. So the servants asked him, do you want us to go and pull them up? So we kind of hit another little moment. Funny thing is, Jesus explains his parable later on, so maybe I should wait till then, but I'll do it now. This little phrase, I can't help as we go through it, but tell a story. Certainly Simon and John will probably remember that when as we were looking as a church to sort of see more breakthrough in terms of healing and so on, and I'd taken a group out to Bethel, to Bill Johnson's church, because I thought, maybe we'll kind of get something from there. If I go on my own, that's one thing, but I took a group of about 40. And as we arrived and we were driving up to Bethel, one of the vans, or multiple kind of minibuses that were being driven up, the guy driving it turned the wrong way onto a freeway and got hit on the side. The van got thrown across the freeway, rolled over twice, and the car had gone right through the side of our youth worker, our children's worker. And so I arrived, up at the church, 4 hours drive away, with lots of people looking very pale and sheepish, saying, you've got to turn around and go back, because there's been this terrible accident. And to cut a long story short, because there was lots of things I could tell you from there, but it's really about this phrase. We'd prayed many times for Becky, and she had some remarkable kind of little medical breakthroughs. They thought she would die. She didn't die. They thought that she wouldn't be able to return home for months. She was able to return home within a week or so, but she was then under a hospital locally. They looked at her x-rays and they couldn't understand how she'd survived, seeing as so much trauma she's had inside. But she was kind of, she was wheelchair bound. She was told that she would never walk without sticks. We kept on praying for her. We did all the things you're supposed to do in prayer. And we had a worship evening one night. We kind of got used to the situation. She was there. It was an open worship time, so there weren't many chairs. She was in one of them because she had to. She'd brought it right into the middle of the worship, so there was one chair in the middle, and she was sitting on that. And as we're getting near the end of the meeting, I saw the caretaker was there, kind of checking his watch, see whether we were going to go or not. And I was leading, and so I thought, we're going to have to close up in a minute. But Becky had got up on her crutches and come forward and just shared something from the front. There's nothing to do with her situation. I think it was just a word she felt Lord was giving us. She'd gone back on her crutches to sit down, and I just felt like Lord said, go and pray for her again. So I went and said, Becky, you're right if I pray for you again? And she said, fine. And I stood behind her as she was sitting down. I put my hands on her shoulders. And as I put my hands on her shoulders, I had this phrase, an enemy did this. And I just spoke it out loud. I said, an enemy did this. And she flew forwards off the chair, which is not a good sign when when you've got someone who's so her ability to walk and legs are in such a mess. sprawled out on the floor, and she started to retch, and I started to pray about. I felt there was a spirit of fear and a spirit of death, and prayed about these things. And she kind of threw up some stuff on the floor, which sometimes goes with these things. And then the caretaker was looking at his watch, so I called over one of our ladies who does a lot of praying. So can you keep praying for her? It felt like there was now peace in the situation. She was calm, just lying there. And I went and closed up the meeting. And while I was closing up the meeting, she got up without her crutches and ran around the room, waving them in the air. So that was a lovely story from my point of view. Some of you will remember that. I'm just thinking, you can give me a thumbs up if you remember the event, if either John or Simon was there. Were either of you there, John or Simon? You weren't there, no. Don't worry, I muted you, so I couldn't hear you. No, they're saying something. Do you want to say something, Simon?
I would say neither of us went to Bethel, but I remember the story, and I remember Becky. She had a broken pelvis. Yeah,
she had a smashed pelvis. Yeah, it was totally.
Yeah. No, I was. We Alison and I went to Bethel, but I don't remember that story. I don't remember that story about Becky and that prayer meeting and that worship meeting that you just told. I don't remember that, although of course I have seen the work that God has done in her body. And
yeah, that's true. You've seen her walking around now, so
yeah.
There you go. So anyway, I just the thing was, it was an enemy did it. That was really that was the key thing. And we live in a world with these mysteries and the things. There are things sewn into it that it creates a sense of mystery. We have to somehow accept the fact that we are in a warfare, that there is an enemy, there is stuff that is sown that is not God's plan, etc., etc. And then the servants say, do you want us to go and pull them up? And I always think this is an interesting bit because, we want to fix everything. But actually the master says no, because in case you're pulling up the weeds, you uproot the wheat with them. And actually, there's a real warning here is if you try and force people to do the right thing because it's the right thing, and we don't want to see bad things, you actually end up very often killing the wheat as well. Could be in the person. So we have to be very cautious about being too political in the sense of we know how to fix this, as opposed to invitational into a process that is transformation. So there's just that kind of little bit of tension in these verses. So Jesus says, allow both to grow together. And of course, as we think about it, that grace on a personal level, I'm so grateful for when I look back, because there were things about me that I didn't realize were really part of the enemy's sowing. I just thought they were me, and I thought everybody should be gracious towards me. And then I start to see them with a bit more clarity. I think I'm really glad that Jesus actually allowed the things to be grown, so that actually he didn't cut off so much of who I am, that actually as we move into the next life, I'm only a shadow of my former self. What he wants to do is transform me to carry as much of me through as possible, if I can put it that way. Think of it like that. So we allow them both to grow together, and I'll tell the reapers, first gather the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, and then gather together the wheat into my barn. Oops, hang on, let's go back here. So it seems at this stage that Jesus has finished his parable. We're going to come back to it because he explains it a little bit. So we'll just park it for the minute. So he presented another parable to the saints, and the kingdom of heaven is like a grain of mustard, which a man took and sowed in his field, which is one of the smallest of the seeds. And most of your translations will say something like, which is indeed the smallest of all seeds. But the little word indeed is a kind of a positive emphasis, and it can be used in that kind of comparative sense. So I thought one of makes more sense, makes it, it's not necessarily the smallest seed ever in the universe, but he's saying it's kind of one of those small ones. So which is one of the smallest of all the seeds. But when it's grown, it's greater than the garden plants and becomes a tree. So the birds of the air come and camp in its branches. And you kind of contrast with what this has just gone by, which is there's all sorts of good things sown, but often those good things start very, very small. And of course, the mustard seed never becomes a great big cedar tree, but actually it grows to a place where it is useful. And there's something about the seed in everybody, which we've got to be careful we don't pull out, even if it's the tiniest mustard seeds. We want to give as much room for that to grow and become fruitful and useful in a kingdom sense. So it's a kind of an interesting little contrast. And so then he tells them another parable. He told them, so the kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. Now notice, do you remember how I pointed out a couple of weeks ago, there's the reference to who are my disciples? And it was talking about, and Jesus actually in that context starts to address women as disciples. And so actually that little transition, which we so often miss, because of the additional word that moves from it being the sons and disciples into sons and daughters, I think it is, and so on. And actually suddenly Jesus is addressing the fact that he has women listening to him and he is treating them as disciples. So those disciples, even those female disciples, are part of my family, and which in its context was a massive kind of leap that Jesus is doing within the flow of what he's started. So if you remember, he gathers men to him, but straight away there are women who've been impacted who start to follow along with him and follow him in those things. And in that transitional kind of passage, as we're looking at it, Jesus starts to address them and include them in the term disciples. And so we see that now being expressed because Jesus now includes in his parables of the kingdom something that they fully relate to. So it's like the woman who takes a little bit of yeast and mixes it into the flour until all of it's leavened. So there's something very small about the kingdom. That's kind of one of the themes, but that also helps to contrast with the idea of what's being sown, and we don't want to lose it. We want to reap all of the benefit of what God has sown, not be so enthusiastic in getting rid of the what's wrong that we end up crushing those things and losing that. These things, all of it, Jesus talked to them in parables. Again, I've made a decision that the word order in the Greek is these things, all of it. It normally just gets translated as all of these things Jesus talked in parables, but I quite like the immediacy feel. These things, all of it, Jesus talked in parables to the crowds, and he didn't speak to them without a parable, which doesn't mean to say he never said anything to them that wasn't a parable, but he wasn't in a kind of teaching mode with them, which didn't include these sorts of ideas that to get your head around, you had to stop and talk about and get different people's perspectives on. And I think it's like this, and somebody else says, no, I think it's like that. And those things become far more memorable and they get far more worked into us. And as we're going to see, they also enable us to kind of get they get to a truth without hitting, without having to clearly identify what might be the offense. I put that in quotes, the offense. We often talk about the offense of the cross. There are difficult parts in the gospel. And actually, the kind of kindness with which Jesus presents some of these things allows people to understand in ways that if we try to get too specific with the meaning of them, would actually is more likely to get the person to run into something which in our humanity we might use as an excuse not to go further. What do I mean by that? All truth is offensive. If we want everything to be the way I want it to be, the trouble is, as to quote the phrase that the American Jewish commentator Ben Shapiro throws around, has turned into a little internet meme, which is facts don't care about your feelings. That's the part of the problem, is when you really kind of dig down to truth, at the end of the day, facts don't care about your feelings. And actually, if part of our presentation is too much of the facts, it doesn't care about people's feelings, and actually it loses people, it rejects from them. The nice thing about stories is that actually there is always the ambiguity as to how literally or not they should be taken. And that means you can sometimes bypass. If I give an example, because I had an illustration this week where I'd used a phrase and somebody had found it really, really helpful. And they had shared it with somebody who's not a Christian, who had then had taken a bit of offense at it. And it just kind of highlighted that, and in our conversation, they're saying, well, the trouble is I was using it rather broadly. I wasn't trying to apply to a situation like this person was in, being quoted onto. But the more precisely we are, and the more we think that our precise statements are kind of absolute and for everything, the more often we're going to kind of cause that pain that drives people away. Whereas the nice thing in the kind of discussional side of a parable, how literally should we take this bit? How much should we take that bit? And so on. It actually allows you to say, that's not really important. This was an illustrative story to help you feel something about your situation. Actually, that's a very helpful way of getting people through the difficult things. It's not that those harder things shouldn't be addressed, but sometimes, particularly as I said, when they've got an emotional fact to them, what people don't need to hear is a logical answer. What they need to hear is an emotional endorsement, with something that helps to bring some sort of a layer of resolution, a cover to it. As they get through that and it's less emotive, then perhaps you can bring in the more concrete elements of truth. So he didn't speak to them without a parable. And so was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet, saying, I'll open my mouth in parables, I'll utter things hidden since the foundation of the world. So then once he'd dismissed the crowds, he went into the house, and his disciples came to him saying, explain to us the parable of the weeds and the field, of the field. So they're wanting something quite concrete in terms of explanation, something that isn't something that Jesus has given to the crowd, but they're still trying to get their head around how these things work. So one of the things, as we're going to see, is what Jesus said at the beginning of this passage was a parable isn't just a simple analogy, but you can debate it as if it was, and in your different solutions, then somehow it's the discussion that's made it the parable. Now, by asking Jesus, they're getting something quite concrete, which is not therefore untrue, but isn't necessarily what you want to kind of give to the crowd. So he replied, so the one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. Okay, so they're probably getting an idea at this stage. This is something about Jesus and his divinity, this phrase he uses of himself. So in the sowing, in this illustration, it was me doing the sowing. And the field is the whole world. The field is the world. The good seed are the sons of the kingdom. Now, that's a phrase we got to kind of park for a second. And the weeds are the sons of evil. You'll often see the evil one, but the word one is being implied. So I think the King James just said sons of the wicked, sons of wicked, or no, sons of wickedness, it says, because there's no definite article there. So it's sons of something that is corrupt. It's sons of corruption, sons of wickedness, which I think I prefer in this kind of context. And the enemy who sowed them is the false accuser. Now that's a literal translation of the diabolo, the word diabolo, dia, which goes across and throws across. It's someone who throws an accusation at you. So I've gone for false accuser. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels. So Jesus has now made some of the elements concrete, but actually, look, they are still reasonably fuzzy, even as he tries to explain to his disciples. If we just draw that out a little bit, as therefore the weeds are gathered up and burned with the fire, so it will be at the end of this age. Okay, so that fits within those who take a more kind of predestination view of the world. You know, the world's full of people, some that God's destined for heaven, some that he's destined for hell. He lets them all live together, and then he sucks those out. But then the next phrase, the Son of Man will send forth his angels and will gather out of his kingdom all the stumbling blocks and those who practice lawlessness. And those practicing lawlessness. Now, in the understanding of the people that Jesus is speaking to, this is slightly different. The kingdom is the world is where Jesus has been sowing stuff out, and it's a process of becoming the kingdom. But out of that kingdom, he takes the stumbling blocks, which aren't people; they're situations. So one of the things that's getting taken out are those awful situations that give us a problem with God. And those practicing lawlessness, there's a very kind of deliberate and harsh element to this. It's not just a kind of a question of those who aren't yet calling themselves Christians or aren't yet following Jesus. There's something much more extreme in his wording. So I'm not trying to fully analyze, but what I want to say is to be cautious as you try and interpret, because some of those bad seed are just situations. They're the kind of situations that cause the questions. But equally, and as those things are being dealt with and removed, some of them aren't people at all. They're just those situations. And then the people that we're focused on, there's quite a strong kind of sense of they are practicing lawlessness rather than it just being in an unsaved state, if I can put it that way. Now, I'm not going to try and land exactly what this means, because that's the point. Parables are part of the discussional thing. What I'm trying to kind of illustrate is the is the potential to look at this from different angles. And although the disciples asked Jesus to kind of land some things, he still leaves room in his answer for there to be some debates on what does that mean. So it's gone from the world to his kingdom. So what does that mean? It's got his angels are going forth. It's the end of the age, the end of my life, end of whatever. Is it? When is the end of the age? That's another question they asked. There are other questions in the mix. And so to fully kind of get the truthful impact of the parable is something we have to engage with and look at from the different situations and have that sort of internal tussle. And as we kind of do that, what we get a real sense of is that what Jesus is driving at is that actually God's approach to this world is gracious. He's allowing stuff to grow. Some of that stuff is so small it seems insignificant now, but actually we want to let it grow because it could become like could become big enough for a couple of birds to make their homes there. It in actual fact, it can be as tiny as a little bit of yeast. A tiny small part of yeast actually makes 3 loaves. So we don't want to crush those small things. And you can all be blasé because you think those people are really bad and you're only a little bit bad, but actually we don't want to do that too quickly. It will all be addressed. So this is the kind of the general flow that we can all kind of agree on. The details, which sometimes people want to become much more tied down, who's in, who's out, is it you, is it me, all of those kinds of things. That's part of why that's part of the offense, that there's always the potential in that to cause offense. It's not that there's no truth there, but the style and the narrative allows people to juggle with it. And if you're in that place trying to answer the question, then you're involved in the process to which the word has gone out. If that makes sense. Hopefully that makes sense. It's now producing, it's kind of putting down roots in you because you're talking about it, you're discussing it. So that's the run through the verses, I think. Oh no, I've got a few more. They will throw them into the fiery furnace and there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of the Father. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Again, I'm not going to quickly dwell too much on this. As we've gone through Matthew's gospel, I've tried to highlight a few times that we read phrases like this, and sometimes we see them as all about heaven or hell, which they're not necessarily in the context that Jesus is speaking. That the rabbis use things like the furnace, which is about removing of dross. It can be a purifying thing, and so on. Gnashing of teeth. Jesus talks about the wise and foolish virgins who come, and the ones who get there late are left at the outside edge in outer darkness, where there is gnashing of teeth. And the thing in that parable is they're not excluded from the wedding, but they don't enjoy it as much because actually they missed the opportunity they could have had. So it's not always about being fully in and fully out. It's more about whereabouts in the midst of what God is doing. So I just want, as I say, I don't want to kind of land and say this is what it must mean, but I want to highlight the breadth very often, because unfortunately, as we've had years and years of training through the same schools who generation after generation give the same answers to the same questions, it's very difficult sometimes to see some of these stories in a slightly broader context. And then we've missed the very point in which they were given, if you think of it like that. So I think then, yeah, there you go. Thanks for watching. So hopefully that's not been too confusing for folks. What I'm trying to illustrate is what I think is really fundamental to our Christian faith, which is the real life-based interaction with the idea of the Word of God, rather than we've reduced it all to a set of acceptable answers, and we can put that on a T-shirt, stick it on a book on our shelves, and kind of roll out the right answers at the right time. That actually the real fruitful life, the greatest revelation comes living in mystery. The greatest grace, I believe, finds by living actively in the sense of the mystery, the kind of the dialogue around the stories, and what does it mean? So those are my heretical 2p's worth for this afternoon. Would anyone like to ask any questions or make any comments at this point? So we're missing our regular question askers. Barbara is often one of the first.
Yeah.
Nope. No one has anything they'd like to ask or comment on or disagree with. I'm really happy on that.
Oh, that was interesting about the fiery furnace and the gnashing of teeth, having a different perspective on that, because we are so ingrained with the sort of standard evangelical.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I touched on it when we were doing the Sermon on the Mount. If you look at the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus references a huge amount of rabbinic writing. You can go and look it up. You can go and see it. He references some comments by Shammai, kind of half quotes them, but he disagrees with them. He references the perspectives of Hillel, who is another famous rabbi who generation before Jesus. And in particular, the one I found was really interesting is there's an important Qumran document, the Rules of Community, therefore is an Essene piece of logic, which references calling of people names, you fool, Raka, the adultery and lust, and what was the other one? I can't remember. It addresses three of the themes that are in Jesus, and with all of them, it's framed in the fires of Gehenna. But so that seems to be Jesus referring to an Essene teaching in that context. But the fires of Gehenna are actually much more like purgatory, because you come out of them. So I remember being told as a kid, we've got to see every time Jesus uses those phrases as being like the book of Enoch, because in Enoch, Gehenna is permanent damnation for people. But actually what's contemporary with Jesus, what you can say is actually here Gehenna is being used more like purgatory. And it's more of a refining process that you have to have burnt out of you, if that makes sense. So I'm not saying then that's what Jesus meant or that's what he didn't mean. But what I'm saying is we have to debate it in the round. We discuss it in the round. And right today, it might be more comfortable if I believe it this way. But as I get more secure in my faith or whatever, then I might actually start to contemplate the harder meanings too. And that's what I mean by actually the narrative story somehow allows us to take on board a hard truth, a fact that doesn't care about my feeling, but actually kind of juggle it in a way that it doesn't burn me too quickly. So, judgment is real and it's not pleasant. But while I'm debating exactly how it works, I can manage it and internalize it in a way that's less about the fear it produces and more about the serious consequence it instills. So, does anyone else like to comment or ask anything?
Yeah, I don't know if it's a wrong question. Like I don't know if there's a straight answer to it. But you were talking about Gehenna and purgatory being a purifying process, and it makes me think about ideas I've taken on. I remember somebody called Nancy Cohen was talking about baptism of fire, that we undergo baptism in water. Some of us get baptized in the Spirit, and then some of us in this life go through to different degrees a baptism of fire, or we recognize that that's what we're experiencing. And I'm thinking, is this a kind of a final thing, or is it something that we go through as a process in this life, not just at the end of this life? I'm not talking about the end of the age, but the end of our lives, at least.
So if you take that little phrase, baptism of fire, it's actually truncated from the Holy Spirit and with fire, and Jesus quotes that twice, and the second time in Acts, he leaves out the fire. So right. Which would leave you to think that actually there's something about what's going on in the baptism with the Holy Spirit. It's the holiness of the Holy Spirit in this life is potentially the way we might encounter the fire. Now, it might be a slow burn ember, and others it might be you go through an experience that is really fast and extreme. But there is something consuming and purifying in fire, and that is part of the work of the Holy Spirit. And that's always something not to be forgotten. Likewise, don't hear me saying that Gehenna is purgatory. What I'm saying is that when you look at the way people treated it and the conversation that Jesus has, there are all of these different perspectives in the round. If you've got someone who's more devoted to the book of Enoch, they might see it very differently. But actually, the Essenes, if they are the Essenes from the Qumran community, we have Gehenna is because their assumption is all God's committed himself to the children of Israel, so he wants to get them all saved eventually. but some of them have definitely got to have some stuff burnt out of them, and so they see Gehenna as a purifying process. But they still have a debate about whether some people get out or not, and their debate includes the people that Jesus talks about, people who slander other people's reputation, people who commit adultery with a respectable person's wife. That might be that might be unforgivable, for instance, and they never get out of Gehenna. So Jesus is clearly addressing them because he's got the same kind of context, but actually he's moving the attention away from the punishment to the actually, so how should we now live? So don't worry so much about what the eternal situation might be, but actually what should you do in the now? Try not to get into the place where you're causing someone to call you a fool or you're calling them a fool. Try not to get into the place where you're lusting after somebody else's wife. Whether or not you've actually committed adultery with her, and actually whether you're now arguing about the pros and cons as to whether that means you're stuck in Gehenna forever. His emphasis is saying move away from that, to be aware that there is a judgment coming. What are the details like? We can debate those things, we can argue around them. But how then should we now live? That's
yeah. Cool. Thanks, Chris. Yeah.
Any other thoughts or questions? You will often pick up is that I'm not militantly wanting to say everything we've inherited from our evangelical history is wrong, but I'm kind of cautiously saying I find it far more helpful to open questions up that sometimes step outside the boundaries of what we've been passed on as acceptable to think. And because actually sometimes it's in pushing those out and trying to see things from a different angle, we actually see things much deeper and with more clarity and with more grace and perhaps more revelation, So hopefully that clarifies, in case you're worrying about me. Yeah. Good. Anything else anyone would like to ask or comment on?
No, I don't think so.
No. Well, as always, it's been really lovely seeing folks. We'll do the last parable, set of parables next week, and then we'll probably take a break after that. So one more week before the summer. Hopefully it won't be so hot next week.
Yeah.
Good. Well, I will say goodbye then, and I will see you in a week's time.
Yeah.
See you folks. Have a good week.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Cheerio.